I just first want to say how grateful we are to the Fosters and what they have done to raise awareness about addiction and to tell us the story of Alex. And it's such a tragic story. And I have to ask, I want to start with Dave and Gideon, who were involved in putting together that documentary. And you've also been deeply involved the last several years in watching Purdue and reading documents about their conduct over the years. Do you think Alex Foster would be alive today were it not for Purdue Pharma?
You gonna take that one, Gideon?
I mean, it's of course impossible to say, but and from what I know from what his parents have talked about Alex, he struggled with issues and was apparently self-medicating. But I do think that the easy, ready availability of OxyContin definitely made it much more likely that he died.
Yeah, I would agree with that. I mean, I think the important thing to remember here is that, this crisis was not born from some illegal drugs coming in from Mexico or being made in a lab in China. These were legally prescribed drugs that flooded the market, really potent drugs. I mean, OxyContin was a new kind of drug in terms of potency, 160 milligram pill to start with, where Percocet's 5 milligrams of active ingredients. So that changed the whole game, and the marketing of it changed the whole game. So, there's clearly a relationship there.
There's been such attention nationally on Purdue lately, but the three of you really were on the case very early. And when Dave came to STAT 4 years ago, Gideon was his editor, and we immediately launched on a lawsuit against Purdue in Kentucky. And simultaneously, Joanna and the AG's office was doing its own investigation, starting its own something of a parallel investigation into Purdue in Massachusetts. Can you all talk about your individual investigations and how they started in the first place? Dave, do you
Well,
want
I
to
can, from my standpoint, I've been interested in opioids and Purdue for a long time. When I came to STAT, there was a case in Kentucky that was a really important case because they had actually made some progress in gathering evidence, and as we now know, did the first, and until very recently, only deposition of a member of the Sackler family. So when that case settled, we wanted to get the documents that the state of Kentucky had obtained. And like in so many of these cases, it turns out that there was a secrecy agreement, that the evidence gathered was not going to be public. So we decided that we were going to go to court and we were going to become a party to this case and see if we could do something about that. So it was one of the first decisions we made at STAT, and a really important one. And that sort of, started the whole process of us looking harder at the company and the family.
Yeah, so we actually filed a motion in a courthouse in eastern Kentucky, in Pike County, Kentucky, and where the case in Kentucky had actually been filed in this remote courthouse in a county where there were lots and lots of people who had died of opioid overdoses, particularly OxyContin overdoses. And we asked the judge in that court to unseal the documents. And our lawyers actually told us that our odds of success were less than 50-50. But within a month, that judge ordered that the documents be made open. And Purdue Pharma immediately appealed to the Kentucky Court of Appeals. It took 2 years, but the Kentucky Court of Appeals last December ruled in our favor that these documents had to be unsealed. And now Purdue has gone to the state Supreme Court in Kentucky and asked them to, for discretionary review, to consider another appeal. And we're waiting now for the Kentucky Supreme Court to rule on that.
And so how Massachusetts, how did you all get involved?
So it's interesting. I think our paths have really run kind of parallel over the last 4 years. Our investigation started 4 years ago when Attorney General Healy took office. It's been a top priority for us since that time. And, those of us who didn't have the chops to become journalists, I think we view the law as a really important, it has a really important storytelling role. And so we've spent, countless hours reviewing millions of pages of documents over the last 4 years with a big team, and really trying to uncover the story of what we believe happened here. And we've, really also relied on the incredible reporting that's happened. So thank you guys so much for that. I think we've seen out of this company a number of different tactics. David alluded to some of them, to try to avoid kind of a public airing of what happened and full sort of accountability, sealing of documents, confidentiality agreements, buyouts of executives. In our case, when we simply wanted to file our complaint, which is about 274 pages long, lots of detail, and the first complaint to name members of the Sackler family, members of the board of directors, and the executives of the company, we saw a really concerted effort by Purdue to avoid having that happen by fighting us in court.
Now, that was a big deal, the first state that named the Sacklers. Why did you decide to do that, and did you know it would have a powerful effect?
Well, in our work, as in yours, we go where the facts take us. And really the facts took us to a board of directors who had a really intensely involved role in crafting a strategy around the promotion and the sale of these drugs, with a goal of trying to sell as many doses as possible to as many people as possible for as long as possible. And I think it's important to set this against the backdrop of what happened in 2007 with the company. In 2007, the company pleaded guilty to federal crimes, entered into a set of agreements across the country to change their practices. And so our investigation is really just looking at what happened after that. What did they do? Did they change their ways? And what we found is that they, we alleged they didn't, and they continued, now knowing full well the really addictive nature of the drug, the deadly nature of the drug, and what was happening in the country in terms of a public health crisis, really just trying to sell as much as they could for profit. And so because of how involved we believe the directors were, we thought, it was the right thing to name them.
Now, three of you have read through, as you said, millions of documents. Dave, why don't you tell us, is there one document of all that you've read that said, oh my God?
Well, I wish it was that dramatic, but for me, we spent years trying to get this deposition of Richard Sackler, who was president of the company, a board member, spent his life at the company, and of course realized, along with other family members, billions of dollars in profits from the company. So to me, when we finally got a hold of the deposition, which, by the way, the courts have still not ruled on, we obtained it in another way, it was really striking to see him have to be accountable. And I was struck by how cavalier he was about a number of things, and how he sort of discarded any suggestion that even inadvertently the company might have played a role in this crisis. And I think, when we talk about accountability, which has been lacking in this story, that was really important. And an aha moment for me was him denying that they deliberately misled doctors about the potency of OxyContin and tried to parse words about what potent means, when they knew that doctors didn't think it was as potent as morphine, and that helped them sell it for things like backaches. And that was a critical decision. He was in on it. It's clear as day in the deposition, and that was a big defining moment for me.
How about for you two?
For me, I think one of the things that Richard Sackler said in an email that was in the Massachusetts AG's complaint once it was finally unsealed was, he said, we have to hammer on the abusers. And he called people who are struggling with opioid use disorder criminals, reckless criminals. And I think that really showed the frame of mind of him and the rest of the management and of Purdue Pharma. And I think I think we all bear some, share some responsibility for that, because it's much too easy And I sort of think back to how we, as a society, and I myself, viewed people back in the late 1990s and early 2000s when this was really taking off. And I don't think we really saw addiction as a disease as much as we're beginning to now, and I think that has to change.
Any?
Yeah, I think that it's a great point. I think for me, there were a number of things we uncovered that I found alarming, but I think one was an effort that David actually reported on to by Purdue to get into the addiction treatment space as well, so that they had, helped to create this opioid crisis, profited off of it, pocketed, we allege, billions of dollars in the process, and then developed something they called Project Tango, which was a proposal to then also make money off the crisis by getting into addiction treatment. And I just, I think that we're guided in so much of the work that we do as an office by the families who've been impacted by this crisis. And, thank you to the Fosters and so many others who've done such incredible advocacy in this space. I know that was one piece of information that community found particularly offensive.
How many cases are there now around the country? Like dozens and dozens?
No, there's hundreds and hundreds.
Right.
In the multi-district litigation in Ohio, there's, I think, now 1,500 cases that have been consolidated.
Wow.
I think the problem is, there's been a lot of litigation over the years, but the settlements haven't changed behavior. And there hasn't been accountability. You talk about the families. Families want to know how we got here, exactly how we got here. We're learning more and more, but we still don't know so much. There's millions, I think you can correct me, Joanna, but I think like 45 million pages of documents Purdue has submitted in the multi-district litigation. We've only seen, maybe a couple hundred publicly of those documents. So it seems to me, and I think the Massachusetts AG deserves credit for not only pursuing this case, but pursuing it with its own lawyers. They're not using outside firms, and putting out a complaint that actually details, like never before, what happened here. That we need more of that going forward. We need less AG standing up and saying we're getting millions of dollars today. Oh, and by the way, all these records will be secret. That's going to help change behavior, and that we need that kind of accountability.
And what's your thinking, Joanna, about Oklahoma has a very sort of rigorous laid out plan of how they settled with Purdue. Is that a model, or is that something that you think there shouldn't be settlements? States shouldn't settle?
Well, I think each state has to be guided, in its own decision making, hopefully by the people in the state and sort of what they want to see. For us, the families we work with, I think what we hear over and over again is what David just said, that accountability is the most important thing, getting the story out there of what happened and making sure that it never happens again. And I think the only way we can do that is to really turn the rock over and figure out exactly who did what and who was part of that decision making and how it happened, and to make sure that then ultimately there's the right remedies in place. And that's where the courts can come in. That's where, our role in filing litigation, we get to ask for penalties, we get to ask for injunctive relief, and so we'll do that. But right now our focus is on getting the story out there, hopefully getting the documents released and letting the American public know what happened.
I think it's interesting,
Yep.
just if I can jump in, that Purdue has done a lot. They've bought full-page newspaper ads. They've been working really hard in the last year or so to say that they've changed their stripes. They're a different company, where they're law-abiding. But you have to ask, if they're so interested in going straight, I don't know if I can say that, but then why are they still fighting the release of documents? Why have they appealed to judges' orders to release the documents in Kentucky and not just agree to let them go?
Would it be your preference that Massachusetts not settle?
I think our preference right now is to get the facts out there And it's interesting, when we filed our complaint, and ultimately when the court allowed it to be filed publicly, Purdue said we had cherry-picked our allegations and that they weren't true, but hasn't come forward. We said, okay, then make the documents public, and ultimately a judge will decide, but let the public decide, where the truth lies, and that process will happen just as you guys do fact checking. Our work will be fact checked by a judge, and there will be that opportunity. But I think it's important to remember that this is a case where the harm is so devastating, where you have hundreds of thousands of families across the country impacted, many of whom have lost a child, and the concept of a remedy, the concept of what would be enough money, there is no amount of money. So we really are focused on, as I said, accountability and changes in practice.
Do you, in your dream, does a Sackler need to go to jail?
I think there are a lot of families who believe that there should be, some sort of criminal case. Right now, ours is a civil case.
Right.
And that's where we can get this injunctive relief that will help sort of hopefully change practices. But there were, criminal pleas in 2007. I think. But
they were misdemeanors. Nobody went to jail. And in fact, we now know, thanks to the Massachusetts Attorney General, Purdue paid millions of dollars after that plea to the executives who pled. So they weren't exactly punished. In fact, one of them continued to work at the company. So to me, accountability is, well, if my freedom's at stake, maybe I'll think twice about doing this kind of marketing. We haven't seen that. I mean, Insys now has a criminal trial going on. Maybe we'll see it there, but we just haven't seen it. And behavior hasn't changed. It's paying a toll. We'll pay 100 million fines. We'll move on.
Now, Dave, you broke the story on the Sackler deposition, and it was featured, of all places, a couple weeks ago on John Oliver's Last Week Tonight, and which gave it a whole different audience. So have you ever written a story, gotten a document that you've seen featured in a half-hour HBO program? And could you tell everyone a little bit about that and what impact you think this attention could have on the overall case?
Well, I think in all seriousness, it's first of all, it's odd to see a document that's sort of a dry court document reenacted by famous actors on the John Oliver show. But I think what that says is we've reached kind of a tipping point here, right? People view this family differently. They view their charitable endeavors differently. And people are aching for some sort of reckoning here. And now it's in the popular culture. And I think that, to me, says people kind of get it now. And people want to change. I mean, one of the points of the John Oliver piece was, well, we want to see the video deposition. We want to see how this guy answered, his mannerisms, how he said it, because we're still fighting for that. So I just think it's a tipping point, that episode, among others.
What about, now Purdue is, as Gideon said, they're doing a sort of PR offensive, but they're in real financial trouble. They could declare bankruptcy. How might that affect these cases, do you all think?
Well, I'm not a lawyer. You are, so maybe you should answer the question. But my sense is that it makes it there's all the more reason to not settle for cash settlements, but to really to not let them go that way, but to go after the documents and really get the story out there of what happened.
Well, I'll just say, because we've named the Sacklers individually, the directors and executives, that would be ultimately separate from a bankruptcy proceeding by the company, obviously. But I think, certainly that's something that we've seen a lot of reporting about, heard a lot of rumors about, and that would have a big impact on the cases for sure. And I totally agree with Gideon that I think that's part of what motivates us in trying to get information out there as much as we can and as quickly as we can, and trying to avoid a situation that's happened in the past in multiple, lawsuits where things have ultimately been buried. And so that's our goal.
And since this whole summit is about fixes, do you think the situation has been fixed in any way? Do you think that Purdue, a company like Purdue, could get away with what they got away with again?
I think yes, if we don't start to see these millions of documents that have been filed. We need to see the evidence. What don't we know already? What was the interaction with the DEA and the FDA and the regulators, who for years didn't do anything. They fronted patient groups. They infiltrated medical societies. The literature was impacted. I mean, I could go on and on and on. We need a full accounting of this, not unlike tobacco. It's interesting, University of California, San Francisco has a document archive from big industries. They have millions and millions of documents from the tobacco litigation, 5,000 documents from drug industry litigation. We got a long way to go here to understand what happened. And until then, yes, other companies can do the same thing.
Yeah, and I think there's starting to be some reporting now about the drug distributors, the sort of the wholesalers and the middlemen. So there was, Purdue, not to let Purdue Pharma off the hook, because I would never do that, but there were many organizations, many companies involved in creating this epidemic that we have now. And they included the drug distributors, they included the retail pharmacies, they included the medical groups that took the money from these organizations and
universities.
Universities. So it's and we're only now beginning to put the pieces together.
Okay. Do we have time for some questions?
Is it?
Okay.
Timer
Oh, they're
says
right
no.
here. How do we do have time. How do we address how the distrust of pharma and its role in the epidemic is now impacting the acceptance of medication-assisted treatment?
Well, that's a tough one because medication-assisted treatments had a problem with acceptance for a while now. You see the cynicism of Purdue Pharma when they decided when OxyContin sales were going down, let's get into that business. So I get it. I think education's one thing. I will admit that when I first learned about drugs like Suboxone being used to treat people, I didn't understand it. I did sort of buy into the one opioid for another argument, and as I learned more, I realized that that's not the case, that this is really effective medication that people really need to have. So I think just people need to keep hammering away at how effective this is, how people have a right to it.
In our work, we do, in addition to the litigation we're up to, we also do a lot of work on prevention, education, and trying to reduce the stigma of addiction. And I think part of that you see, perpetuated for many years by Purdue Pharma in terms of their messaging. Laying the blame on others, laying the blame on patients. The quote about hammering on the abusers. And so we still have a ways to go, but I think those kinds of public education efforts, everyone in this room probably has someone in their family who has struggled with addiction. And so I think trying to understand this as a disease is really part of that puzzle.
Yeah, and just there's legislation. We had a piece about this morning, I think, that there's legislation being filed to allow buprenorphine to be, right now the restrictions on prescribing of it, and to basically say anybody who is licensed to prescribe controlled substances should be able to prescribe buprenorphine to their patients.
And just one last thing before we go, and I wanted to ask Gideon about, when you talk about public interest in this, you've seen a lot from what Purdue has done about issues of stigma surrounding opioid addiction. Can you talk a little about that?
Yeah, so I think we've touched on that a little bit, but I think that the stigma that Purdue kind of helped to encourage, and that you can see it throughout the industry. You can see it in the resistance to opioid-assisted treatments. You can see it in how a lot of the drug treatment industry. We've written a number of stories. Dave, when he was still with STAT, we wrote a number of stories about these really disreputable outfits that are taking advantage of people's very generous insurance coverage. They bring them down to Florida, where a lot of these outfits are, and they provide really terrible treatment. And part of it is that they argue that, they say, we're not giving you opioids, we're not giving you any more opioids, it's going to be cold turkey, face-based treatment. There's no evidence, and again, we have to go back to what does the medical evidence show. The evidence shows that the medication-assisted therapies are effective for many people, there's not a lot of evidence that for many people the treatments, the going cold turkey works, but yet there's a lot of profiteering in the treatment business that is relying on that model.
Well, I thank the three of you for the illuminating discussion on such a topical, serious problem.
Thank you.